Okay, so I'd like to move on a little bit if I can, because we will run out of time, to this third of the Brahmaviharas. And in Pali, again, compassion is a word that the early translators borrowed from the Gospels, because again, they could not find a fitting or appropriate English translation of Anukampa Karuṇā. There wasn't a single word that really fitted this. So compassion, like mindfulness, was borrowed from the Gospels. If I could, I want to read you just a short piece by a doctor. He says, I stand by the bed where a young woman lies, her face post-operative, her mouth twisted in palsy, clownish. A tiny twig of the facial nerve, the one to the muscles of her mouth, has been severed. She will be thus from now on. As a surgeon, I'd followed with religious fervor the curve of her flesh, I promise you that. Nevertheless, to remove the tumor in her cheek, I had to cut the little nerve. Her young husband is in the room. He stands on the opposite side of the bed, and together they seem to dwell in the evening light, isolated from me, private. Who are they? I asked myself. He and this wry mouth who gaze and touch each other so generously. The woman speaks. Will my mouth always be like this, she asks. Yes, I say. It's because the nerve was cut. She nods as silence, but the young man smiles. I like it, he says. It's kind of cute. All at once, I know who he is. I understand, and I lower my gaze. One is not bold in an encounter with the goodness. Unmindful of my presence, he bends to kiss her crooked mouth. And I'm so close, I can see how he twists his own lips to accommodate hers, to show her that their kiss still works. And I let the wonder in. Anukampa Karuṇā. To translate this, Anukampa is empathy. It's empathy. It's the ability to listen. Sometimes it's described as the heart that can tremble in the face of the world. Sometimes translated as one who can listen to the cries of the universe. This quality of empathy, of stillness, of listening, of connectedness beneath the words. Beneath the words. Karuṇā is to act, to turn outwardly, to respond, and to act. So in the Buddhist teaching of what we call compassion, this is a twofold word. First, the empathy, the listening, and then the response. And both are considered to be equally important. If we skip the empathy part when we're faced with distress, we easily jump right into busyness. And how do I fix this? Or how do I make something go away? So the empathy part is so important, as is the action, the turning towards. But sometimes the only action we can offer is our continued listening. Sometimes there is suffering that cannot be fixed. There is suffering that doesn't go away, that doesn't have solutions. And yet we can always turn up. And as I mentioned, well, I didn't say it so specifically, but often in Buddhist art, in Buddhist iconography, you see this figure of Kuan Yin, who is meant to embody or represent this Anukampa Karuṇā. And very often when you see this image, sometimes it's female, sometimes it's male, but it always has this sense of receptivity, of openness, of kindness, of gentleness. What you don't see so much of, which is also very much present in Buddhist art, are the images of Kuan Yin as an armed warrior. You know, mounted with swords and crossbows and, you know, fully weaponized. And the mission of Kuan Yin in this mode is to uproot the causes of suffering. Uproot the causes of suffering in terms of craving, in terms of hatred, in terms of delusion, in terms of the unacceptable that causes suffering. So there is nothing that is particularly passive about compassion. It is engaged. It is fully engaged with uprooting the causes of suffering. Now, the insight part of Anukampa Karuṇā is in its relationship to dukkha. Now, many of you, of course, will be familiar with the word dukkha. It is the embarkation point for most people's paths. We meet pain. We meet distress. You know? And it occurs to us there may be a way out of distress and out of a lot of pain. So dukkha, it's the core of the Buddhist teaching. You know, it's there in the first ennobling truth that there is dukkha, and that dukkha is to be understood. And the Buddha said, I teach just one thing, that there is dukkha and that there is the end of dukkha. Now, if I go into this term just a little bit more, dukkha is, I think, really sadly, mostly translated as suffering. It's actually not really an accurate translation. The accurate translation comes more in the form of an image. That if you have two cartwheels with the center of the cart there to take the axle, and the axle is square and the center of the cart is round, right? So you're putting a square axle into a round hole. And it literally translates as a messy space. So if you put a square axle into a round hole, you're in for a bumpy ride. And this is dukkha. This is dukkha. Now, I usually, these days, I prefer the translation of vulnerability. As human beings, we are vulnerable. And the Buddha speaks about the different layers of dukkha, or the different layers of vulnerability. As human beings, we are vulnerable to what is called dukkha dukkha, or the pain of pain, aging, sickness, and death. Woven into all of our lives, none of us have an exemption. It's not a fun ride, always aging, sickness, and death, and we are all equally vulnerable. Me too. Yeah? This is woven into my DNA, it's woven into my genes. This too, I will be asked to meet. The second domain of dukkha is called anicca dukkha. We are all vulnerable as human beings to the reality of change, impermanence. Sometimes impermanence is good news, isn't it? You know, the end of a root canal, the end of a thunderstorm, you know, sometimes it's good news, things change, we're enthusiastic. Other times we're not enthusiastic. You know, we lose things. We lose people we care about, you know, we lose certain securities, we lose certain certainties, the pleasant experiences come to an end and change, you know, the pleasant meal comes to an end, it changes. People we care about change, not always in ways that we really applaud. And yet we are all vulnerable. Again, none of us has an exemption. And this area of vulnerability is not emotionally neutral. You know, we don't just sit there and say, well, change happens. You know, no, we grieve. We grieve our losses. You know, there is sadness in many of those changes. This is not something unwelcome. But again, this area of dukkha, this area of vulnerability, is woven into our being from the moment that we were born. The third domain of dukkha that the Buddha speaks about is viparinami dukkha. It's the dukkha of uncertainty. As human beings, we are vulnerable in living in a world of conditions that we don't control always. We live in a world of conditions that we don't always choose and that mostly we don't control. Our worlds can crumble in a moment. We know this. You know? Our certainties can crumble. Our security can crumble. Our familiarities can crumble because we are not in control of that world of conditions. And so as human beings, we are vulnerable to uncertainty. We're vulnerable to instability. And again, none of us are exempt, are we? None of us are exempt. The fourth domain of dukkha is sankhata dukkha or sankhara dukkha. And this is the dukkha of patterns. Patterns of confusion, patterns of reactivity, our wanting, our not wanting, our liking, our hating, our views of self, our views of others, our tendency to cling, to hold, to contract. All of this is the world of patterning. Now this sankhata dukkha is usually the argument that we have with the first three layers of dukkha. We don't want aging, sickness, and death, you know. We don't want unwelcome change. We don't want instability. And so what is brought forward are these patterns of reactivity, of aversion, of craving, of contractedness, of clinging, as a way of arguing with those first three domains of dukkha. Is that clear enough? Okay. This fourth domain of dukkha is optional. No matter how wise we are, no matter how liberated we are still going to have dukkha, the pain of, the pain of pain. We're still going to have aging, sickness, of death. We're still going to have change. We're still going to have uncertainty, but we may not have distress. We may not have distress. We may not have that argument that says, this shouldn't be happening to me. It's okay if it happens to other people, but, this shouldn't be happening to me, This is the dukkha that is optional. Now, in terms of Anukampa Karuṇā, as an insight, as an understanding, it has a very powerful relationship to our own relationship to dukkha. If we are afraid of dukkha, if we are afraid of aging, sickness, and death, if we're afraid of uncertainty, if we're afraid of change, then this is very much going to shape how we view ourselves and how we engage with life. If we are afraid of dukkha, we're probably going to get into a lot of defense mechanisms, a lot of attempts to protect ourselves from aging, sickness, and death, from change, from uncertainty. We're probably going to get into a lot of avoidance mechanisms. We're probably going to get into a lot of camouflage mechanisms. What can I do to pretend this isn't happening? We're probably going to get into a lot of busyness, trying to endlessly fix the world of conditions that we live in to have the maximum amount of pleasure, and so the most secure self, and the minimum amount of the unpleasant and the less secure self. If we are not afraid of dukkha, if we have found the resources inwardly and the understanding inwardly to really look life in the eye, and to know deeply that aging, sickness, and death, and everything that comes with it is woven into our birth. To know deeply that we are not in control, that we were never the pilot in the cockpit, that we will never be successful in rearranging conditions so that we never feel challenged or uncertain. If we know change deeply, we won't be surprised. We won't be shocked. We won't be dismayed. by the changes that come into our lives. And this will also shape our sense of who we are and how we engage with the world. If we are afraid of dukkha, we will see ourselves as being somewhat incapable, somewhat inadequate human being. If we are not afraid of dukkha, we will be able to respond and have confidence in our capacity to navigate dukkha in the best ways that we can. Doesn't mean that we won't feel sad, doesn't mean that we don't have losses, but we won't be surprised. We won't be surprised. Last year I decided to sit on a chair when I practice. I spent my whole practice life sitting on the cushion, totally happy, totally content, and because I started very young, pretty cooperative body, felt very grounded, felt this was, great way for me to practice. Last year I decided to sit in a chair. It's preemptive action. Between birth and death, there is the chair. This is preemptive action. I am protecting my future joints. Even though I'm quite content sitting on the floor, quite happy, I decide I'm going to protect my future joints. I'm not going to wait until I have to sit in a chair and feel resentful of that, and feel, I've lost my perfect sitting posture, I'm going to protect my future joints. I quite happily sit in a chair. If we really understand dukkha, we will not be surprised. Many of you know that one of the triggers for depressive relapse is unexpected loss. I think if we really understand dukkha, there are losses that will be very deeply sad, but not so many that are unexpected. Not so many that are unexpected. Ajahn Chah, who's one of the great forest masters, he had a very favorite teacup someone had gifted to him. And he said in his teaching, "For me, this cup is already broken." And he said this with a great smile on his face. He wasn't depressed, He said it with a great smile on his face. "For me, this cup is already broken." Compassion responds to dukkha. Compassion responds to dukkha. It knows how to listen. Knows how to listen rather than to blame or to feel ashamed or to be arguing that this shouldn't be happening. To be arguing that this shouldn't be happening. Dukkha knows pain as pain, sorrow as sorrow, suffering as suffering, distress as distress, and it can take the I out. It can take the I out. It's not about my suffering or your suffering. It is about simply meeting the dukkha that is woven into life with a very deep listening and at times a very immediate, clear responsiveness to heal what can be healed and to bring the causes of distress to an end. I think this is a piece in the Buddhist teaching so overlooked, that he didn't passively sit around in a cave saying, well, that's just how life is, or that life is sometimes unfair. He challenged causes of distress that were really optional and unacceptable. That were optional and unacceptable. That are mechanisms of perpetuating distress over and over. There is no hierarchy in distress. I think sometimes people, when they're cultivating compassion, they feel, well, it's not worth having a lot of care, a lot of compassion about my aching knee when people are living in the middle of, tragedies or war zones. But there's not really a hierarchy in suffering. Suffering is suffering. It asks for the same response. And the suffering that we can respond to, of course, is the suffering that is right in front of us. The suffering that's right in front of us. And sometimes this takes from us a little step out of our comfort zones to understand why that suffering is there. I find that more and more, and I'm not saying that to sort of have some sort of pretense of being ultra compassionate, but I find more and more, I'm not used to living in London, and I've been living in London most of the last year, and it's the first time I've ever lived somewhere where people ask me for food, you know, and I find that so, it just kind of stuns me. Someone's not asking me for money, they're asking me for food. And I've found that it's so important to, you know, not to immediately reach into my purse or, you know, or you know, go into the store, but, you know, to really ask what's going on here for you, you know? And the stories are heartbreaking. The stories are heartbreaking, you know? And, you know, curiosity, we need to understand dukkha. We need to understand its roots and how it arises and what response is appropriate and helpful and really healing. But this is what the path asks of us, and I think this is what a flourishing human being is committed to. This quality of listening deeply to the world around us and to the world within us. This is something more than an emotion or a feeling. I think this is really related to a very deep dedication to bringing distress to an end. And, you know, sometimes it's not about grand gestures. Sometimes it's about very small gestures of listening, of reaching out. But it is, I would say, that karuna is an act of agency. It's an act of conscious choice to engage, rather than to remain disengaged. You know, I very much like these images of the armed warrior. I feel it really takes us out of this zone of just thinking that it's enough just to feel my heart tremble. It's not actually enough, sometimes. It's not actually enough. The person in front of us is asking for more than a heart that trembles. You know? Sometimes we're asking for more than a heart that trembles. And, you know, I realize it might be a bit contentious statement, but I think there's something in a person dedicated to awakening is a person dedicated to bringing dukkha to an end. And these are really interrelated, you know, they're really interrelated. So, I don't even know where all that came from. Again, I just want to speak about the interrelated nature of these qualities, that, and they're not separate from mindfulness. You know, mindfulness is about turning towards all events and experiences. Metta is about standing near to. Compassion is to respond to the difficult and sorrowful in a fearless and wise way. And equanimity is to be able to know that groundedness in the midst of it all. Milarepa, who was a great Indian practitioner, teacher, he said, just as I would instinctively reach out to care for a wound in my leg as part of this body, why would I not instinctively reach out to care for the wound in another as part of this body? Compassion is complicated, isn't it? I mean, it's not difficult to find that sense of empathy and response in relationship to what I would call innocent dukkha. You know, a crying child, a wounded animal, a very ill child, someone who just seems so undeserving of what's happening to them in their lives. You know, it's what I call innocent suffering, innocent pain, and our heart trembles and we reach out. It's far more complicated when we come to those places in our lives and people in our lives who seem to be more guided by ignorance, more guided by ill will, who perpetuate suffering, who inflict suffering on others. Now, here compassion is really, this is the challenging territory of compassion, truly challenging territory of compassion. When I first began to practice in a tradition that really centralized compassion, and bodhicitta and the bodhisattva vow, and everything that came with that, my teacher used to talk about compassion for ignorance. And, you know, the Westerners, of course, we were a small group, but, you know, mostly everyone was in agreement in saying that they couldn't find compassion for those who inflicted pain. And our teacher had the stock response of swallow the blame, swallow the blame, swallow the blame. And we would go, oh no, you know, swallow the blame, they're going to get away with it, you know, they're not going to take responsibility, no one's going to be accountable. He would say, swallow the blame, swallow the blame. And it took me a long time, really, and I'm still maybe in a process of understanding this, that when I blame someone for ignorance, I have given up all sense of possibility. I can hold a person accountable for their actions. I cannot always hold a person accountable for their ignorance. I can hold a person accountable for the ways that that ignorance manifests. But I also wonder, where is the beginning of ignorance? Where is the beginning of hatred? You know, where is the beginning of aversion and fear? You know, how many generations does it go back? What happens to a person who's never had the opportunity to know another pathway to follow? What happens to a person who's so blinded by that inheritance that they see no other way of being? What happens to a person who's so captive of their own destructive patterns that they cannot ever see even a glimmer of another way of being? It doesn't mean that my heart trembles in the face of their suffering, but I can perhaps understand ignorance and I understand the vastness of ignorance in this world. That doesn't paralyze us. It doesn't make us indifferent. It's why we do what we do. Because, you know, here we're in the business of dispelling ignorance. It means that we challenge it. It means that we question it. It means that we do what we can to stop the destruction of ignorance, you know. We do everything that we can. And yet still somewhere I need to hold. It's really challenging. You know, we've got plenty of people to practice with at the moment. It's really, really challenging, you know, not just to sort of turn off the news when somebody appears or their voice is heard, you know, to actually force us. I need to stay with this because here's where I actually really am going to find that commitment to ending this, you know. So I'm going to find the commitment to ending this. I have to say this is an open question, okay? It's an open question. The Dalai Lama put it very clearly that we cannot afford hatred. And we cannot afford hatred. Hatred, and as the Buddha put it, hatred breeds hatred. You know? Hatred breeds hatred. Somewhere the tide has to turn, not in terms of a sort of, you know, superficial forgiveness or a superficial compassion, but with a dedication to ending the causes of suffering. Really a dedication to ending that. And this is all the landscape of compassion. It's all the landscape of compassion. You know, more and more I appreciate the toughness of this landscape. The toughness of this landscape and what it asks of us. I cannot pretend that I am perfect in this. I think maybe perhaps the Buddha was, but I certainly cannot pretend that I am perfect in this. And yet there's something about that not being perfect in it that actually inspires me. That actually there's some holding somewhere of this person should be different than they are. And perhaps they should be, but they're also a prisoner of their story.